June 17, 1944, the Atlantic Ocean, 30 nautical miles west of the Azores. Captain Lieutenant Helmut Summers stood in the cramped control room of U-853, his gloved fingers resting on the navigation table. Through the periscope lens, there was nothing but an endless sheet of gray water stretching to a low, unbroken horizon. For 3 long weeks, the Type IXC submarine had lingered on station, assigned not to attack convoys or stalk destroyers, but to transmit weather reports. Every 6 hours, atmospheric data was sent back to headquarters in occupied France, ready to transmit the weather report. "Herr Kalu," the radio man said, his headphones pressed tight against his ears. Summer nodded. The message encoded through the curse signal system was just 25 characters long. At the hands of an experienced operator, the transmission took roughly 20 seconds. Standard practice. Fast enough, the Germans believed, to evade detection by British direction-finding systems, which needed nearly a minute to obtain a bearing. Within 10 minutes, aircraft from the American escort carrier USS Croatan would arrive overhead. Within 10 days, they would find U-853 again. Summer and his men still believed what they had been taught, that brief radio transmissions meant safety, that the ocean still offered concealment. They were fighting with assumptions that had already died months before, hunted by a technology they didn't even know existed. The transformation of the Battle of the Atlantic didn't come with a single dramatic revelation. It arrived gradually through near misses, strange encounters, and destroyers that appeared impossibly fast after each routine transmission. By the spring of 1943, U-boat commanders began to whisper about it. Why did escorts now seem to anticipate their every move? Why did aircraft appear mere minutes after surfacing to send short reports? At first, the German Naval Command dismissed it, but the pattern was undeniable and devastating. Between 1939 and 1945, German U-boats would sink nearly 3,000 Allied merchant ships, totaling over 14 million gross registered tons. For a time, it nearly starved Britain and brought the Allied war effort to the brink of collapse. But by May 1943, the month remembered by submariners as Black May, the tide had turned. 41 U-boats were destroyed that month alone, nearly 1/4 of the operational fleet. The once favorable exchange ratio collapsed, where Germany once sank. 100,000 tons of shipping for every U-boat lost. It now managed barely 10,000, and the weapon that accomplished this reversal wasn't a torpedo or a depth charge. It was a receiver and antenna array connected to an oscilloscope. High-frequency direction. Finding Huff Duff to the sailors who used it could detect a submarine's radio transmission and display its bearing instantly. With just 2 or 3 readings from different ships, Allied forces could triangulate a U-boat's exact position and dispatch aircraft or destroyers within minutes. It's estimated that HFDF alone accounted for nearly 1/4 of all U-boat losses during the war. When Captain Lieutenant Helmut Summer took command of U-853 in June 1943, he inherited both a proven vessel and a doctrine forged in early war triumphs. The Type IXC displaced over 1,100 tons on the surface, stretched 76 meters in length, and could travel 21,000 nautical miles without refueling. It carried 6 torpedo tubes for forward, 2 aft, and 22 torpedoes in total, a single 8.8 centimeters deck gun, and anti-aircraft armament completed its surface arsenal. Its crew, 48 men, were among the best. Trained in the German Navy, Summer himself had completed submarine school, tactical training, and to patrols as an executive officer before earning his own command. They drilled relentlessly, silent running, damage control, attack angles, sonar recognition. They knew their machinery intimately. They trusted their training, but what they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that their enemy had already outgrown the very principles their doctrine relied upon. The German Naval Command was aware of radio direction finding, at least in theory. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat arm, understood that prolonged transmissions could be dangerous. That's why he authorized the curse signal code system. Ultra-short messages designed to transmit faster than Allied receivers could react. But their calculations were based on outdated assumptions. German equipment still relied on slow, rotating loop antennas that required up to a minute to obtain a bearing. To them, a 20-second message seemed safe. It was against the technology they knew about, but it was catastrophically wrong against what the British and Americans had built. By mid-1942, Royal Navy escorts carried shipboard HFDF sets that required no mechanical rotation. Fixed antennas fed signals directly to a cathode ray oscilloscope, instantly displaying a bearing as an elliptical trace. 2 readings meant a rough fix. 3 meant a precise position. This breakthrough came from research originally meant to track lightning experiments by Robert Watson Watt in the 1920s that eventually gave birth not just to Huff Duff, but to radar itself. By 1943, nearly every Allied destroyer escort carried the equipment. Combined with a global network of shore-based HFDF stations from Iceland to Gibraltar, from Newfoundland to the Caribbean, the Atlantic had become a wired battlefield, and for Dunnits, whose Wolfpack tactics depended entirely on radio coordination. This was fatal. The very communications that made U-boats lethal now made them vulnerable. Each contact report, each weather message betrayed its sender's position, and as the Allies learned to listen, the hunters became the hunted. Throughout 1943, returning U-boat commanders spoke in low voices at bases across France and Norway. They couldn't explain how escorts seemed to know where they were. They couldn't understand how aircraft found them within minutes of surfacing. The ocean. Once their refuge had become transparent, and as the casualty lists grew longer, the faith in radio discipline encryption and stealth began to collapse, one transmission at a time. During the Cold War, both NATO and Warsaw Pact navies maintained vast direction-finding networks to track submarine movements. What began as manual oscilloscope readings evolved into computerized systems capable of processing multiple signals simultaneously across wide frequency ranges modern electronic warfare suites inherited. These routes integrating direction, finding as a core function alongside radar, sonar, and communications intelligence, the lessons of the Battle of the Atlantic had not been forgotten. They directly shaped the design and doctrine of post-war submarine fleets. The Soviet Union, having captured German Type 21 submarines in their design documents at the war's end, built its own submarine force around those late-war principles. The focus shifted toward true submarines, vessels meant to operate primarily underwater, minimizing exposure on the surface, where they were vulnerable to radar and visual detection. Nuclear propulsion, introduced in the 1950s, finally delivered the sustained underwater capability that German engineers had once tried to approximate with large battery banks and snorkel systems. Across the ocean, the United States Navy absorbed both the technological and tactical lessons of the anti-submarine campaign, and from the study of captured German equipment. Post-war American submarine design emphasized underwater performance, sound quieting to evade sonar, and operational autonomy to reduce communication risks. Submarines of the Cold War era were built specifically to counter the very direction-finding and sonar networks that had proven so deadly to German U-boats. The struggle between detection and stealth, born in the Atlantic during World War II, continued through the Cold War and into the modern age. The psychological impact on German naval culture was lasting. When the Federal Republic of Germany's Navy was established in 1956, it inherited a deep institutional memory of the staggering losses suffered in the U-boat arm. Training now emphasized caution, technical mastery, and cooperation with Allied forces, a stark contrast to the aggressive independence that had once defined the wartime submarine fleet. Many former submariners carried those hard-learned lessons into the new Navy. They knew too well the cost of underestimating enemy capabilities and of relying on outdated technology. Several U-boat commanders who survived the war later wrote memoirs, describing the mental strain of operating under constant threat. Time and again, they recalled the eerie feeling that the enemy always seemed to know their position. Wolfgang Eltiach, one of Germany's most decorated submarine commanders, wrote that after May 1943, "It felt like sailing into a trap every time we left port." He described the crushing anxiety of wondering whether each transmission would summon aircraft, whether surfacing to recharge batteries would lead to radar detection, whether even routine maneuvers might be their last. Post-war analysis by both German and Allied researchers confirmed his fears. High-frequency direction finding HFDF played a decisive role in the Allied victory. The data showed overwhelming correlation between radio transmissions and subsequent attacks. Submarines that maintained strict radio silence survived far longer than those that transmitted regularly, but complete silence was impossible. German doctrine depended on centralized control and coordination through radio communication. The very system that once gave them strategic coherence ultimately contained the seeds of their defeat once the Allies deployed instantaneous direction-finding technology. Broader strategic lessons extended far beyond submarine warfare. The Battle of the Atlantic proved that technological superiority, coupled with industrial power, could overcome even the most skilled adversaries. Germany entered the war with experienced crews, solid tactics, and capable equipment. Yet within just 4 years, Allied innovation and mass production rendered those advantages obsolete. It was a pattern repeated across multiple fronts. German tank designs that dominated in 1940 were outdated by 1943. Luftwaffe aircraft that ruled the skies over Poland. And France were outclassed by 1944. The Kriegsmarine's surface fleet became irrelevant once Allied naval production reached full capacity. The U-boat campaign had been Germany's most dangerous threat to Allied victory. Had the submarines succeeded in severing the Atlantic supply lines, Britain could have been starved into surrender, and the invasion of Europe made impossible. For much of the war, that outcome hung in the balance. By early 1943, the margin was razor thin. Technologies like HFDF, coupled with increased escort production, expanded air cover, and intelligence breakthroughs from Enigma decrypts, tipped the balance. Each incremental advantage, radar, sonar, acoustic torpedoes compounded the others. Overwhelming German capabilities despite the bravery and skill of U-boat crews, the story of Germany's U-boats and HFDF stands as a timeless lesson in warfare. Once a technological advantage is achieved, it becomes nearly impossible to overcome through tactics alone. The U-boat crews of 1943 and 1944 were no less skilled or courageous than those who triumphed earlier in the war, but the world around them had changed. They had been taught that brief transmissions were safe. Experience proved otherwise. They believed the vastness of the ocean offered concealment. Reality revealed that they were being tracked across thousands of miles. They trusted that diving meant safety. Allied sonar and homing torpedoes shattered that illusion. Every assumption, carefully taught and once validated by early successes, collapsed under the weight of technological evolution. When Kapana Lieutenant Helmut Sommer authorized that weather transmission on June 17, 1944, he acted exactly as doctrine demanded. The transmission lasted 19 seconds. The Kurtz-Nally code had reduced it to the bare minimum. The radio operator performed flawlessly. Every known precaution was followed. None of it mattered. Within seconds, an HFDF operator aboard the USS Croatan had obtained a bearing. Within minutes, aircraft were airborne. The hunt that would end 10 days later had begun, triggered by a technology Sommer could not see, could not fight, and barely understood. This cycle of technological surprise and delayed recognition defined the Battle of the Atlantic. German Naval Command knew of Allied direction finding, yet underestimated its power. They suspected radar had advanced, but failed to counter it. They trusted Enigma's security, even as evidence mounted to the contrary. Each misjudgment deepened the losses. Losses paid for in the lives of BMAR. The lesson endures beyond World War II. Any military that fails to assess its enemy accurately, that clings to obsolete assumptions, or resists adaptation, faces inevitable disaster. No matter its skill or bravery, the German U-boat force of 1943 to 1945 demonstrated this with brutal clarity. 87% casualties. 785 boats lost, 28,000 men dead. These were not mere statistics. They were the human cost of institutional blindness.
The Allied victory in the Atlantic required more than HF/DF. It demanded integration: radar, sonar, acoustic torpedoes, and signals intelligence, all woven into a single operational web. It required industrial might to build escort ships and aircraft in staggering numbers. It required training thousands of operators to master complex electronics. It required adaptability, a willingness to evolve tactics as technology changed. And above all, it required understanding, the ability to see the enemy as he truly was, not as doctrine imagined him to be. For the men who crewed the U-boats in the war's final years, these strategic lessons offered no comfort. They knew only that their chances of survival diminished with every patrol, that missions once routine now ended in silence, that the ocean, once their refuge, had turned against them. They transmitted brief signals and died when aircraft arrived impossibly fast. They maintained radio discipline and died when escorts appeared over the horizon. They followed orders faithfully and died because those orders no longer fit the war they were fighting. HF/DF was not a wonder weapon. It did not guarantee victory in any single encounter. It simply provided an edge, a few minutes warning, a direction accurate enough to vector aircraft, enough intelligence to reroute convoys. Those small advantages, multiplied across thousands of engagements, proved decisive. When Helmut Sommer authorized that final transmission from U-853 on June 17, 1944, he could not have known that the signal would betray him to equipment first designed 8 years earlier for meteorological research. He could not have imagined that Allied innovation had rendered his training obsolete. He did everything right. He followed procedures, maintained discipline, executed orders. But the ocean was no longer his. It belonged to those who had learned to hear every pulse, track every whisper, and hunt with scientific precision, refined through relentless